Let's take a step back and talk about environmental impacts. A mini lesson on the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, which requires federal agencies to integrate environmental values into their decision-making processes. They make federal agencies consider the environmental impacts of the proposed actions and some reasonable alternatives. You must also consider connected actions and cumulative impacts. And if a significant impact is anticipated or either identified in an environmental assessment, then an environmental impact statement is required. The Corps of Engineers regulates the Clean Water Act, Section 404 permit process for impacts to wetlands or other waters of the state, as it's said in the regulation. The development of the megasite required a 404 application and permit because of the amount of wetlands, over 200 acres, that it was going to fill and impact. The approval or issuing of the 404 permit was a major federal action that the Corps of Engineers then had to do environmental impacts analysis, or NEPA, on. Not being told about the water demands for the megasite caused the Corps to overlook what we argue are significant impacts. There was a careful timeline of misinformation. In a nutshell, the JDA told Hyundai in April of 22 that groundwater wells would be constructed to meet the water needs for the site. Then 2 months later told the Corps of Engineers utilities were available and no groundwater permits would be needed. Fast forward nearly 2 years and we all hear about the groundwater wells in Bullock County to serve a site in Bryan County that's constructed already. And the EPD models impacts of up to 19 feet of drawdown on the aquifer, requiring a mitigation fund, though the Corps said no significant impact. Then the governor just released the budget for 26 and amended budget for 25, calling for $500 million of surface water infrastructure to serve coastal Georgia's unprecedented growth. Without the megasite, we wouldn't have that growth. It's all connected, and every bit of it should have been part of the Corps' analysis of cumulative impacts to get a true idea of what environmental impacts would be associated with the development and permitting of the megasite. Meanwhile, the EPD is working to assess impacts of the 4 groundwater wells in Bullock County, and some weekly staff meeting notes show unreasonable adverse effects to public water systems at Eldora Farms and Olney Station, citing 32 to 41 feet of drawdown. The information EPD presented back in August focused on private wells, saying nothing more than 19 feet, certainly nothing over the 30 feet mark they consider adverse. But for public water systems, they had already identified unreasonable adverse impacts nearly 2 years prior. Looking at the deeper details, back in 2019, when the site was proposed to be a gas-powered vehicle manufacturing facility, they did a 404 permit application and NEPA analysis. Then the plan changed and it became an EV site, adding hundreds more acres to the site plan. A 404 permit modification and related NEPA was done, though we argue not to the extent required due to the missing information on the groundwater demands, coupled with the $500 million of surface water infrastructure that's required to meet water demands of the site for the long term. So in April of 2022, JDA told Hyundai that they would have to have 4 groundwater wells to serve the site, and then 2 months later filled out a 404 permit application that said utilities were available and no new groundwater permits would be needed. In September of 22, Bryan County wrote a letter to EPD about the groundwater needs of 4 wells in Bullock County to serve the megasite. The next month, the Corps declared in its updated NEPA analysis that there would be no significant impacts, making no mention of water needs expected, saying it would be reasonable to assume that Bryan County's municipal supply would be adequate to serve the needs of the site. How could that possibly be true? In February of 24, EPD released their estimates of drawdown on the aquifer, showing that 19 feet worst-case scenario. By June, Ogeechee Riverkeeper filed an intent to sue the Corps of Engineers for their incomplete and inaccurate analysis. The Corps acknowledged the groundwater demands for the site changed things in letters to both the Riverkeeper and the JDA in August, demanding the JDA provide information on how the groundwater withdrawals would impact both ground and surface waters. In October, the EPD issued the final groundwater permits for the wells in Bullock County. Meanwhile, we stayed at work gathering info, asking questions. EPD acknowledged there were no requirements for the individuals who would oversee the mitigation funds. Now, it looks like Bullock County's doing a good job with that, but EPD didn't require any special background for the folks who would oversee making whole of people losing their water. We just saw the governor's mid-year budget, which calls for over $1 billion of water infrastructure across the state, with over $500 million going to surface water infrastructure in coastal Georgia. This was clearly triggered by the development of the megasite, and it appears we are about to mix surface and groundwater to meet regional needs, when citizens should have been able to continue relying on the groundwater resources for years to come, at least in much of our region.
There is a document. It's called the National Environmental Policy Act. It's called NEPA. It's a beautiful piece of legislation. It's the first thing I did as an environmental specialist, and it's how I learned environmental. And I can tell you that there's no conformance to NEPA and the thoughtful planning that is required, because the document that should have the impacts of everything that we're all asking about is called an environmental impact statement, and that's what wasn't done. And we can tell you why it wasn't done. And I'm not pointing blame at an agency. I'm saying that agencies got poor information, and there were people who gave them information at the same time they were telling EPD we need water. They were telling the Army Corps of Engineers we don't need no more water. So when the Army Corps looked at this, they had no reason to believe that there was any water impacts to assess. And the term no one has said tonight and has been careful not to say is the word significant. I've heard preferred, acceptable. A significant impact is a regulatory term within the NEPA statute. And we need to know if it's significant or not. That's not EPD's job to tell us, it's the Corps of Engineers' job. But there should be interagency coordination when something this huge is happening, and I don't see that happening the way I am used to seeing that happening as a federal NEPA practitioner, as a professional who does this, okay?
So what is there left to do? While the Corps of Engineers continues to take a look at the information the JDA provided them, let them know how you feel. We need a new joint public notice based on this updated information. The citizens deserve the ability to make public comments on this new water info regarding groundwater issues for the site. Give them a call, send them an email. I think they deserve to hear from us.